Beneath the grease paint, the John Wayne Gacy story. In the quiet Chicago suburb of Norwood Park Township, the 1970s unfolded much like anywhere else in middle-class America. Children rode bicycles down tree-lined streets, neighbors gathered for weekend barbecues, and a man named John Wayne Gacy built a reputation as a pillar of the community. A successful businessman, a precinct captain for the local Democratic Party, and a volunteer who delighted neighborhood children by performing as Pogo the Clown at hospitals and charity events. Gacy was the kind of neighbor who organized street parties and threw elaborate themed gatherings at his modest ranch house at 8230 West Somerdale Avenue. He was known to boast about his meetings with First Lady Rosalynn Carter, proudly displaying their photograph together. To the casual observer, John Wayne Gacy was the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made man who had overcome a difficult childhood to build a prosperous construction business and a respected place in his community. Behind the carefully constructed facade, however, lurked one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Gacy's path to respectability had not been without stumbles. In 1968, he had been convicted in Iowa of sexually assaulting two teenage boys, serving 18 months of a 10-year sentence before being paroled for good behavior. Upon his release, Gacy returned to Chicago, established his business, and began rebuilding his reputation. Few of his new neighbors knew about his criminal past. Those who did were reassured by Gacy's explanation that he had been wrongfully convicted, that it had been a misunderstanding, that he had learned from the experience and moved on. It was a compelling performance from a man who had become adept at playing different roles for different audiences. To business associates, he was a shrewd contractor who could be counted on to get the job done. To political colleagues, he was an enthusiastic supporter who understood the value of community connections. To young men seeking employment, he was a potential mentor who offered good wages and invaluable experience. And to children, he was Pogo with his bright grease paint smile and silly antics. But there was another role that Gacy played, one he kept hidden from public view. Beginning in 1972, Gacy began luring young men and teenage boys to his home with promises of construction work, money, or alcohol. What followed was a pattern of horrific abuse that culminated in murder. Gacy's usual method involved handcuffing his victims as part of a magic trick or while discussing his work with the local police department. Once restrained, the victims were subjected to sexual assault and torture before being killed, usually by strangulation with a tourniquet technique that Gacy referred to as his rope trick. Most of the victims were buried in the crawl space beneath his house, while others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River when the crawl space became too crowded. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Gacy's crimes was how effectively he maintained his dual life. On the same day that he killed, he might attend a community function or host dinner guests, betraying no sign of the horror that had transpired hours earlier. His basement had been transformed into a charnel house, yet he welcomed friends into his home without hesitation. The foundations of his respectability were literally built upon the bodies of his victims. For 6 years, Gacy's crimes went undetected. Young men vanished, but their disappearances were often attributed to the transient lifestyle many led. Some were runaways, others were assumed to have moved on to different cities in search of better opportunities. The fragmentation of law enforcement jurisdictions in the Chicago area made it difficult to connect the disappearances into a pattern. It was the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest in December 1978 that finally brought Gacy's crimes to light. Piest, unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, had a stable family life and had told someone exactly where he was going to discuss a potential job with a contractor who had been working at the pharmacy where Piest was employed. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police began investigating Piest's disappearance, they discovered Gacy's prior conviction in Iowa. Surveillance was established and a search warrant for Gacy's house was obtained. What investigators found defied comprehension. The remains of dozens of young men buried beneath the house, the lingering smell of decomposition, and Gacy's matter-of-fact confession to murders he termed the cruising and hustling of gays. The excavation of Gacy's crawl space revealed the remains of 27 victims. Additional bodies were recovered from other areas of his property, and 4 were found in the Des Plaines River. In total, 33 victims were identified, though Gacy hinted there might have been more.